Hi friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. My name is Jennifer. As you can see, today we're in my kitchen and we are going to be making one of my favorite bread recipes. This is probably my most commonly made bread recipe. This is a sourdough discard bread. Basically it's called a discard bread because it's made with a sourdough starter, but instead of the fed sourdough starter, it's made with the discard, which is basically, if you're familiar with sourdough starters, when you feed it, you basically have to discard some of your starter rather than feeding the entire starter. Otherwise, it's going to grow and become an unmanageable amount pretty quickly. So, rather than throwing that starter away, there's a lot of really good recipes that you can use to cook with it so it doesn't go to waste. So today we're going to be making a sourdough discard bread, which is pretty much the easiest bread recipe you can imagine. I definitely think that anyone can make this bread recipe. It's a great recipe to start with if you are new to sourdough and aren't really comfortable with baking sourdough yet. And it only takes a few hours, so we're gonna get started. All right, so we're ready to get started. I have all my ingredients laid out here. The first ingredient you're going to need is flour. I have a nice organic all-purpose flour. You could definitely use bread flour instead. That will give you possibly a little bit more rise, a little bit chewier texture. I think that in my personal experience with this specific bread recipe, the results with bread flour and all-purpose flour are pretty close. So I like to go ahead and use mostly all-purpose flour. I do use a little bit of whole wheat bread flour as well, just to get a little bit of the more complex whole wheat flavor and also just to get a little bit of whole wheat nutrition. So that's the first ingredient you're going to need. You could certainly make this with all whole wheat flour instead if you'd like, although you might need a little bit more water because it tends to soak up a little more water, which is our second ingredient, water. So I have some of that ready. You're going to need salt. You will need your sourdough starter. This is actually sourdough discard, which is basically your unfed sourdough starter. So because this sourdough starter isn't fed, it's a discard, it's not going to contribute a lot to the rise of this bread, which means that we will need also commercial yeast as well. So that's what gives this bread its rise. It also what makes it such a quick recipe as opposed to a traditional sourdough bread that takes many hours to rise. So we are going to start with our starter. We are going to, rather than measuring this recipe in volume measurements like cups, we are going to be using grams, which means that you will need a kitchen scale. This is just a basic, really cheap kitchen scale. I think I got this one on Amazon. Very affordable, and it's definitely worth it. I actually find that when it comes to baking bread and sourdough, it's a lot easier and it's a lot more precise to measure in grams rather than cups. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and turn our scale on. We are going to, so it's defaulting to grams right now because that's what I normally use. So you can see right now it says 0 grams. We're going to add our bowl to the scale, which is going to add some weight, and we don't want that to count towards our ingredient weight, so we're going to go ahead and hit the tare button, which will basically zero out our scale. So it's back on 0 grams now. So now the first ingredient that we're going to add is our sourdough discard. We want 100 grams of that, so I'm going to carefully pour this nice and slowly to get 100 grams. Sometimes I do use a little bit extra sourdough discard. I think it adds a little bit to the flavor and still seems to work pretty well in the recipe. So 106 grams. So we went a tiny bit overboard, that's fine. So now we're going to go ahead and zero out our scale. Our next ingredient that we're going to add is our commercial yeast. We need 7 grams of that. And I'm going to go ahead and write out all the ingredients in the description of this video so you don't have to worry about writing this down. I'm also going to link the website where I originally found this recipe so that you can go ahead and visit her website. She has lots of other great recipes as well. So we're going to carefully measure out 7 grams of commercial yeast. Okay. And if you wanted to, so this recipe normally rises for about 2 hours. If you wanted to have a slower, longer rise and a little bit more developed flavor, you could certainly cut down on your amount of yeast. I have done that in the past, especially if I know that I'm going to be gone for a while and not going to be able to bake bread right away. Today we're just going to go ahead and use the 7 grams, but that is, I recommend that maybe the first time you make this recipe, you stick to the recipe, but after you get a little more used to it, you could definitely go ahead and play around with using a little bit less yeast. Okay, so salt. We're going to need 10 grams of salt. So I'm going to carefully measure this, and I forgot to zero out my scale. So we're going till the scale says 17 because I forgot to zero it out after the yeast. So we'll have our 7 grams of yeast plus our 10 grams of salt. But if you remember to zero out your scale and you're not forgetful like me, only put 7 grams in. There we go. So we'll go ahead and zero that out. Now we're going to add our flour, and I am going to add, so we want 450 total grams of flour. So I am going to add about 400 grams of this all-purpose white flour, and then I'm going to add about 50 grams of the whole wheat bread flour. And that's enough to give it just a little bit of depth of flavor from the whole wheat and a little bit of the nutrition without really tasting like a whole wheat bread loaf. And my kids prefer a little bit lighter bread without as much whole wheat, so that's what I make most of the time. All right, so we're just gonna do a little bit at a time until we get up to 400 grams. Almost there. There we go. Okay, 401. So now I'm gonna go ahead and add some of my whole wheat bread flour. We just want to get up to 450 total, combined with the other flour. So about 50 grams of this. Okay, so I went slightly over, but it'll still work. This bread recipe is pretty forgiving. Okay, so now we're going to add our final ingredient, which is water. And we're going to need 360 grams of water. So we're going to add that nice and slowly. Okay, there we go. So now we can go ahead and take our bread off the scale. We're just going to go ahead, mix everything up with a wooden spoon. You don't need to worry about having a stand mixer. You don't need to worry about kneading. This is really the easiest bread recipe you can imagine. So we're just going to go ahead and just mix it up. Make sure you grab everything from the bottom because that's where your sourdough starter is going to be. And I'll just scrape off the sides. And this is going to be a really wet dough. This is going to be definitely wetter than your average sourdough dough and definitely than your average bread dough. You can take a look here. It's wet enough that I can easily stir it up with my spoon. So it's a little bit wet and shaggy, and that is what we want for this recipe. So we are going to go ahead now and let this dough rise for about 2 hours. So I'm just going to go ahead and cover it up. I will meet you back here in 2 hours to check on our bread. All right, it's been about 2.5 hours, so let's check on our bread and see if it's ready to shape. Okay, this looks ready. So I'll show you guys. You can see it's risen quite a bit. It's nice and bubbly on top. Yep, looks like it's ready. So let's go ahead and shape it. I'll take my ring off and stick it here. As a side note, how many of you guys take your rings off to do different things, gardening or baking or whatever, and then totally forget where you put them? I have done that more times than I should probably admit. Thankfully, I have always found it. So, Dad, if you're listening, I've never actually fully lost it. Anyway, so we are going to shape our bread. We're going to shape it right on this parchment paper here. We're going to use this parchment paper to lower it right into the pan that we're going to bake it on. So, one of the most important parts of this bread is to use a lot of flour on this parchment paper. So we're going to really generously sprinkle the flour here. So remember, this is a really wet dough. And so if we don't use a lot of flour, it's going to stick to the paper and it's going to be really hard to shape. It's going to be pretty sticky. So we want a nice thick layer of flour there. Then you're going to take your bread. This dough, you can see it's still really, really wet and loose. We're going to just pour it out onto the flour. You're going to have to kind of scrape the sides off with your fingers here. Once we get it all out here. Now you're going to kind of take your bread. You're going to grab the outer edge and pull it basically into the middle. You're going to go all the way around the bread loaf and pull every side into the middle. And because we have a nice thick layer of flour, it's not sticking as we do this. I usually go around, depending on how loose the dough is, I might go around twice. And kind of gather all the edges together. This is what's going to give you Just a nice shaped loaf that will hold its shape while it cooks. Now we're going to take this bread and we're going to flip it. And this is where the flour really is important. So we're going to flip it over. You can see it kind of sticks to my hand a little bit, but it didn't stick to the paper. And so here, we have a nice round-shaped bread loaf, and we are going to let this just sit and rise for about 20 minutes to a half hour while we preheat our oven. So I'm going to wash my hands, and I will be right back. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put the lid on our flour. We're going to go preheat our oven to 430 degrees, and this bread actually gets baked in a pan like this. So you can use a Dutch oven if you have one. I don't have a Dutch oven, so I'm just going to use this large stainless steel stock pot. This is oven safe up to 430 degrees, which is what we will be baking at. So you can use any stock pot that is oven safe, that's a nice big size like this, that has a lid. So we're gonna go ahead and preheat our oven, and I will meet you back here in about half an hour. Hi, I'm gonna pop back in for a second. I realized I forgot to tell you that when you're preheating your oven, you want to have this pan inside the oven to preheat along with your oven. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop that in the oven, but I just wanted to make sure. That's a pretty important detail. I didn't wanna leave that out. When you put your bread into the pan, you want your pan to be nice and hot. Okay, so it's been 30 minutes. Our oven's all preheated, and it's time to get our bread in the oven. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull out the pan that we had in the oven preheating, and we're gonna slide our bread right in. Okay, so you're just gonna very carefully grab the parchment paper and slide your bread into the pan. We're gonna put the cover on it. And then we're going to stick this back in the oven for 30 minutes. After it's been in the oven for 30 minutes, we are going to come back and we're gonna take the lid off the pan and let it continue cooking for about 12 minutes longer to get a little bit brown on top. So I'll meet you back here in about half an hour. Okay, so our timer just went off. Our bread's been in the oven for 30 minutes. Now it's time to take the lid off so that the top can brown up. I'll pull it out and I'll let you guys see how it looks. Yep, that looks really good so far. You can see it looks nice and opening up naturally on the top. We didn't score the top, so it just had a just opened up naturally. So it's looking good. We're just going to put it back in for 12 minutes and let the top brown up. And I will meet you back here in 12 minutes to see the final product. All right, so our timer just went off. It's time to pull our bread out of the oven and see how it came out. Oh, it looks good. Look at that. Nice and brown and crusty on top. That looks really good. So I'm just gonna pull this out here and we're gonna carefully set it on our cutting board. So take a look at this bread. Doesn't that look beautiful? And like I said, it's seriously such an easy recipe. So I definitely encourage you guys to try this recipe. Now comes probably the hardest part of making bread, which is that you cannot cut into it for at least an hour after it comes out of the oven. So you've been sitting here, watching it cook, smelling it, but you have to wait at least an hour. A couple hours is better, because if you cut into it right away while it's still hot, what's gonna happen is you're gonna let all the steam out, and the texture is gonna be gummy, and what's gonna happen is the rest of the bread as it sits, it's gonna dry out because all that steam has escaped. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna meet you back here a little bit later, and we're gonna cut open the bread and we're gonna see how it is. All right, it's the next morning and we're gonna cut into our bread and see how it looks inside. Looks good. All right, let's enjoy a slice with some nice butter.